On the night Frank Sinatra finally walked onto the Tonight Show stage in 1976, Johnny Carson broke a rule he had never broken in over 14 years of live television, and in doing so exposed a secret so carefully buried that even Sinatra himself believed it would die with him. Because standing just off camera, watching from a small black and white television in a quiet Chicago apartment, was a man Sinatra had never publicly acknowledged as his own son, a man whose existence could shatter the legend America thought it knew, and Johnny Carson knew it before the cameras even rolled. The audience inside Studio One at NBC Burbank that night had no idea what they were about to witness. They had come for charm, nostalgia, maybe a few jokes about Vegas and the Rat Pack, not a reckoning. Frank Sinatra hadn't appeared on Carson's couch in nearly 6 years, and Hollywood insiders whispered that it wasn't scheduling conflicts keeping him away, it was control. Sinatra didn't do interviews unless he owned the room, unless the questions were approved, unless the past stayed exactly where he left it. When Ed McMahon's booming voice announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, Frank Sinatra," the applause was thunderous, the kind reserved for royalty, and Sinatra walked through the curtain with that familiar confident stride, the tilt of the head, the smile that had disarmed presidents and mobsters alike. Johnny Carson stood behind his desk, smiling as always, but something was different. The orchestra finished a half-beat early. Ed noticed. The audience noticed. Sinatra extended his hand, expecting the ritual handshake that opened every Tonight Show interview. Johnny didn't take it. 3 seconds passed. On live television, 3 seconds is an eternity. Sinatra's smile faltered just slightly, barely perceptible, but Carson saw it, and so did the cameras. "Frank," Johnny said calmly into the microphone, his voice steady but lower than usual. "Before we do anything tonight, there's something we need to talk about." A nervous ripple moved through the audience, unsure whether this was a joke, but Sinatra didn't laugh. He knew that tone. He had used it himself when he was about to end something. Ed McMahon leaned forward in his chair, confused, his cue cards useless now. Backstage, the producer froze, hand hovering over the commercial switch. This was not in the rundown. Earlier that afternoon, at 1:42 p.m., a sealed envelope had arrived at Johnny Carson's office, hand-delivered. No return address, marked simply, "For Johnny. Personal." Carson almost ignored it. He was used to fan letters, confessions, threats, pleas. But something about the handwriting stopped him. Inside was a single letter and a folded photograph, priest from being carried for years. The letter was written in a neat, careful hand, the kind that belonged to someone who had learned long ago to choose words precisely. "Johnny," it began, "you don't know me well, but you once knew my mother. Her name was Evelyn Hart." Carson's hands had started shaking before he finished the first page. Evelyn Hart, a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in over 20 years, but one he had never forgotten. In the early 1950s, before Carson was America's favorite host, before Sinatra was untouchable again, Evelyn Hart had been a Broadway understudy who floated through New York like a ghost, brilliant and invisible, working wherever she could, and for a brief, dangerous stretch of time, she had been Frank Sinatra's secret. Carson had known her back when he was still doing radio, still hungry, still human, and she had trusted him because he listened when others didn't. The letter continued. "My mother died last month. Before she passed, she asked me to send this to you. She said you would know what to do." The photograph slipped from the envelope onto Carson's desk. A black and white image of a young woman holding a baby boy, standing in front of a small apartment window, the city blurred behind them. Written on the back in faded ink were 4 words, "He never knew him." Carson sat alone in his office for nearly an hour after reading the letter, the Tonight Show monologue untouched, the studio buzzing around him unaware that the entire tone of the evening had already changed. The letter didn't accuse Sinatra. It didn't ask for money. It didn't threaten exposure. It asked for something far more dangerous. "My son is 32 years old, the letter said. He has never asked for fame, never spoken your name in public. He was told his entire life that silence was the price of survival. Tonight, Frank Sinatra will sit across from you and be celebrated as a man who loved deeply and lived loudly. My mother believed that before she died, the truth deserved one moment of daylight. Not for revenge, for dignity." Carson knew exactly what that meant. Live television was the only place where the truth couldn't be buried by lawyers, publicists, or fear. And Sinatra knew Carson well enough to sense when the ground beneath him was unstable. As he stood there on that stage, his hands still hovering awkwardly in the air, Sinatra searched Johnny's face and saw something he had never seen before: resolve. "Frank," Johnny said again, gently now, but firm, "there's someone watching tonight who was told her story would never be spoken." The audience laughed again, uncertain, but the laughter died quickly when Sinatra's eyes hardened. He slowly lowered his hand. Somewhere in Chicago, a man sat alone on a couch, gripping the edges so tightly his knuckles turned white, because he recognized that tone too: the sound of a door opening after a lifetime of being locked out. Johnny Carson was about to do something no one expected from the safest man on television. He was about to ask a question that could never be taken back. And the legend of Frank Sinatra, carefully constructed over decades, was about to crack, not with a scandal, not with anger, but with the quiet, devastating weight of a truth that had waited far too long to be heard. Frank Sinatra did not sit down right away, and that alone told everyone in Studio One that this was no longer a performance, because Sinatra always sat, always controlled the rhythm. But now his instincts were split between the man he had been trained to be and the man Johnny Carson was quietly forcing him to confront. The audience waited, confused, sensing something dangerous moving beneath the surface, while Ed McMahon glanced between them, unsure whether to intervene or stay silent. And Johnny Carson, calm to the point of unnerving, rested his hands flat on the desk, as if grounding himself before a storm. "You remember Evelyn Hart?" Johnny said, not as a question but as a fact, and Sinatra's eyes flickered for a fraction of a second, a tell so subtle most people would miss it. But Carson didn't. He had spent a lifetime reading faces. Sinatra exhaled slowly and finally sat, straight-backed, composed, but the room could feel the tension humming under his tailored suit. "A long time ago," Sinatra said carefully, choosing each word like a man stepping across thin ice, "a lot of things happened a long time ago." Johnny nodded. "They did," he said, "and most of them stayed buried because that's what powerful men are allowed to do." A murmur rippled through the audience. This wasn't an interview anymore. This was an excavation. Johnny reached beneath the desk and lifted the folded photograph, holding it just low enough that the camera could catch it without fully revealing it. "Evelyn never wanted the spotlight," Johnny continued. "She wanted privacy, and she paid for it with silence." Sinatra's jaw tightened. "Johnny," he said quietly, "we talked about boundaries before I came out here." Johnny met his gaze without flinching. "We talked about questions," he replied. "We didn't talk about the truth." Somewhere in the control room, a producer mouthed the word commercial, but no one moved. Johnny pressed on. "In 1954, when your career was in freefall and your marriage was already broken, Evelyn was the one place you went where no one wanted anything from you except honesty." Sinatra shifted in his chair. The audience leaned forward, breath held. "She didn't call the press when you stopped calling her," Johnny said. "She didn't ask for money when she realized she was pregnant. She didn't even put your name on the birth certificate." That landed like a blow. Sinatra's eyes dropped to the desk. His voice, when he spoke again, was lower, stripped of its usual velvet confidence. "She told me she didn't want a child raised in the shadow of my mistakes." Johnny nodded slowly. "And so she raised him alone," he said, "working 2 jobs, moving cities, making sure the one thing her son never inherited was your chaos." The audience was silent now, not a cough, not a shuffle, only the soft hum of studio lights. Johnny turned slightly toward the camera. "There is a man watching tonight who was told his father was a musician who loved deeply but couldn't stay," he said. "He was told names didn't matter as much as character." Sinatra closed his eyes briefly. For the first time that night, his shoulders sagged, just a little, as if the weight he'd been carrying for decades had finally found a place to land. "I was afraid," Sinatra admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. That single sentence cracked something open in the room. "I was afraid of being ordinary," he continued. "Afraid of failing another person. Afraid of choosing wrong again." Johnny didn't interrupt. He let the silence do its work. "So I did what I always did," Sinatra said. "I walked away before I could be left." Johnny leaned forward now, not aggressive, not triumphant, just present. "Evelyn wrote one thing before she died," he said softly. "She said, 'I don't want my son to be famous. I want him to be seen.' Sinatra swallowed hard. The audience could see his throat move. Does he hate me? Sinatra asked suddenly, the question raw and unguarded, the kind that never made it into press interviews. Johnny shook his head. No, he said. He just wants the truth to stop hiding. The camera caught Sinatra rubbing his hands together, a nervous habit few had ever seen. I don't deserve forgiveness, he said. Johnny nodded. That's not what tonight is about, he replied. It's about acknowledgement. Another long pause settled over the studio. Finally, Sinatra lifted his head and looked directly into the camera, not with the practiced gaze of a performer, but with the uncertain eyes of a man speaking without a script. If you're watching, he said, voice thick, you were never a mistake. The mistake was my silence. No music swelled. No applause followed. Johnny Carson simply let the moment breathe, knowing that something irreversible had just happened. The secret had been spoken, not with anger, not with spectacle, but with a quiet honesty that neither man could take back. And as the cameras kept rolling, it became clear that part 3 would not be about scandal or punishment, but about what happens after the truth finally steps into the light, and whether a legend can survive not by denying his past, but by finally facing it. The studio did not erupt into applause when Frank Sinatra finished speaking, and that absence of noise became the most honest response the audience could offer, because everyone inside Studio One understood they had just witnessed something that wasn't designed to be consumed and forgotten by morning. Johnny Carson did not smile, did not reach for a joke, did not glance at his cue cards. Instead, he leaned forward slightly and said, "Thank you for telling the truth," in a voice so quiet it barely carried past the first row, and Sinatra nodded, his eyes still fixed somewhere beyond the cameras, as if he were looking not at an audience, but at the years he could never get back. Ed McMahon shifted in his chair, visibly emotional, but said nothing, and for the first time in the show's history, Doc Severinsen's band remained completely still, allowing the silence to do the work no music ever could. When Johnny finally called for a commercial break, the cut felt almost intrusive, as though the show itself was reluctant to interrupt what had unfolded. That episode was never rebroadcast in its original form. NBC executives quietly shortened the segment, trimming the long pauses, softening the raw edges, but the truth had already traveled beyond editing rooms and legal departments. Phone lines lit up across the country that night, not with outrage, but with something more unsettling, recognition. Letters arrived in the following weeks, not addressed to Sinatra or Carson, but to the network, from people who had lived their own lives in the shadow of silence, children who had never been acknowledged, parents who had chosen absence over accountability. Sinatra never gave a follow-up interview about the moment, never issued a public apology or explanation, but those close to him noticed a change that couldn't be staged. He began turning down interviews that felt superficial. He stopped joking about his past, as if it were untouchable. And in private, according to those who knew him best, he spoke about responsibility in a way he never had before. Within months, he arranged a quiet meeting in Chicago. No press, no photographers, no handlers. Just two men sitting across from each other without an audience, without scripts, without applause. Nothing from that meeting was ever confirmed publicly, and perhaps that was the point. Some things, once exposed, don't need witnesses anymore. Johnny Carson never mentioned the letter on air again, but a former producer later revealed that Johnny kept Evelyn Hart's photograph in his desk drawer until the day he retired, a reminder that television, when used with restraint and courage, could still tell the truth instead of protecting power. Somewhere, a man who had spent his life believing he existed only as a footnote watched his story step into the light, not as a scandal, not as a headline, but as a fact that could no longer be erased. And on that night, when the applause never came and the cameras eventually stopped rolling, America was reminded that legends are not undone by truth. They are measured by how they respond to it. And sometimes the most powerful ending is not forgiveness or redemption, but the simple, irreversible act of saying, finally and publicly, I was here.